The HOA's new pool was opening the next morning when I arrived with a county plat recorded in 1912. Vanessa Crowe crossed the brand new deck in a bright red blazer, already furious. I unfolded the plat. Inside one small rectangle were 4 words missing from every modern HOA map: Mercer Family Burial Ground. Vanessa looked at the pool, then back at me. That cemetery doesn't exist. The record does, and another document buried in the county files was about to decide whether those gates opened at all. 3 weeks before Vanessa Crowe ever saw that 1912 plat, I thought I was dealing with a fence problem. Nothing more. My name is Graham Voss. I was 54 that summer, and my farm sat along the western edge of Ashford Glen in Cedar County, North Carolina. I didn't live in Ashford Glen. My land was there first. That distinction mattered more to Vanessa than it ever had to me. I ran cattle on just under 180 acres that my father had worked before me. The farmhouse was white clapboard with a porch that leaned slightly downhill. The main barn had a galvanized roof that rattled whenever a summer storm rolled through. Most of the fencing was newer than I was, but a few corner posts had been in the ground so long nobody in my family could tell me exactly when they were set. I never pretended those fences were legal boundaries. Anybody who owns rural land long enough learns that lesson. A fence tells you where somebody wanted livestock to stop. A deed tells you where ownership was supposed to stop. Sometimes those two things line up, sometimes they don't. Ashford Glen had started as a small development on the far side of the county road. Then another phase went in, then another. By the time this happened, there were several hundred houses, 2 decorative ponds, a clubhouse, walking trails, and stone entrance columns that looked like they cost more than my first tractor. I never cared much about any of it. The homeowners stayed on their side. I stayed on mine. Then the HOA announced the pool. They called it the Ashford Glen Aquatic Center. From what I could see through the trees, it was going to be a large swimming pool with a shallow kids section, a wide concrete deck, a mechanical building, landscaping, new fencing, and a parking turnaround connected to the clubhouse road. Vanessa Crowe treated it like the project that would define her presidency. Vanessa was 41 and had been HOA president for a little over 2 years. She was sharp, organized, and almost always looked like she had somewhere more important to be. Whenever she came out to deal with contractors or board business, she wore some version of red: a red blazer, a red coat, a red rain jacket. I don't know whether she did it intentionally, but after a while I could spot her from halfway across a field. Construction started in early spring. For the first month, nothing caught my attention. Dump trucks came and went, trees were cleared, the site was graded, forms went in. Then one Tuesday morning, while I was checking a water trough near the eastern pasture, I noticed that part of an old fence had been taken down. It wasn't much, maybe 30 feet. 2 cedar posts and a stretch of rusty woven wire had been pulled and stacked beside the trees. A fresh orange construction stake stood several feet farther west. On my side, I walked over and looked at it. Numbers were written on the flagging in black marker. I didn't recognize them. A skid steer was working about 50 yards away, so I waited until the operator shut down and waved. A man in a white hard hat walked over. "You with the farm?" he asked. "I own it." He glanced toward the stake. "If this is about the fence, we had to move it for grading." "Who told you the line was here?" He pointed at the orange flag. "Survey crew." "Your survey crew?" "Developers, I guess. I just build off what they give me." That was fair enough. He wasn't the person to argue with. I looked at the distance between the old fence and the new stake. It wasn't enormous, maybe 6 or 7 feet at that particular spot, but farther south toward the pool site, the grading seemed to angle even closer to my side. "Do you have the survey drawing?" He shook his head. "Site superintendent does." "Can I talk to him?" "He'll be back after lunch." I thanked him and went home. That should have been the end of it for the day. Instead, around 11:30, a black SUV came down the subdivision access road and stopped beside the construction fence. Vanessa got out wearing a red blazer and carrying a rolled set of plans. She saw me near the old fence posts and walked straight over. "Graham?" "Vanessa, I heard there was an issue." I asked a question. "The contractor said you were challenging the property line." I asked where the stake came from. She unrolled the plan against the hood of her SUV. It was a clean, modern site drawing, colored landscaping zones, parking dimensions, pool outline, mechanical building, fence, property lines drawn in thick black strokes. Vanessa tapped the western edge. This is the HOA boundary. Based on what? She looked at me. Based on the survey. Which survey? The one prepared for the project. I figured that part. Her mouth tightened. Graham, this project has gone through design review, engineering, permitting, and site planning. Nobody guessed where the property line was. I didn't say they guessed. Then what are you saying? I'm saying that old fence was over there. I pointed. And your new stake is over here. That fence was never the boundary. I know. That answer seemed to throw her off. She had expected me to defend the fence. Instead, I leaned over the drawing. Do you have the boundary survey this line came from? This is the approved site plan. That wasn't what I asked. Vanessa crossed her arms. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then she pointed toward my pasture. Your property is west of this line. The HOA property is east of it. We're not building on your farm. I hope not. You hope not. I haven't seen the record your line is based on. She gave me the look people give when they think a conversation should already be over. You are welcome to hire your own surveyor. That may be what I do. Fine. She rolled up the plans. But the contractor is not stopping work because an old livestock fence was in the wrong place. I didn't ask him to stop. Good. Then she walked back to her SUV. That first conversation with Vanessa wasn't dramatic. Nobody yelled. Nobody threatened anybody. And at that point, I had no reason to believe the HOA had done anything wrong. In fact, I thought there was a decent chance Vanessa was completely right. Old rural fence lines are unreliable. Posts get moved. Trees fall. Landowners straighten awkward corners. Sometimes it is easier to follow a creek or a ridge than the exact deed call. Over decades, a fence can wander, so before I paid anyone to survey the line, I went looking for my own paperwork. My father kept land records in a steel filing cabinet in the room we still called the farm office. Tax maps, closing papers, old aerial photographs, a survey from the 1980s, copies of deeds. Some were originals, some were photocopies of photocopies. I spread them across the desk and started with the newest records. Nothing jumped out. My current deed described the farm using references to earlier surveys and neighboring tracts. The eastern side, the side facing Ashford Glen, was tied partly to older parcels that no longer existed under the same names. That wasn't unusual. Land records accumulate history. One deed points to another. That deed points to a plat. The plat points to a road that changed names 70 years ago. You follow the trail. I found an older deed from before Ashford Glen had been built. Then another. That second copy was difficult to read. The type was faded, and one edge had been cut off when somebody photocopied it. Near the bottom of the legal description, one line caught my eye. It began, "Less and except." Everything after that disappeared into gray blur. I moved the paper beneath the desk lamp, still couldn't read it. The next line contained what looked like a reference, Plat Book 3, then maybe a page number. I checked the newer farm survey, nothing I could connect to it. I checked the county tax map, nothing. Then I found another old document from my mother's side of the family. Her maiden name was Mercer. The Mercers had once owned a much larger tract in that part of Cedar County, including acreage that eventually became Ashford Glen. I knew that much. What I didn't know was how that land had been divided before it was sold. I went back to the faded deed. Less and except, something had been left out of that conveyance. The question was, what? That afternoon, I called the Cedar County Register of Deeds office. A woman answered, and I gave her the plat reference as best I could read it. "Plat Book 3?" she asked. "I think so." "That'll be an older record." "How old?" I heard typing. Then silence. "Do you have a page number?" 17, maybe 70. "The copy is bad." More typing. "Page 17 is a recorded plat." "What year?" Another pause. 1912. I sat back in the chair. "Can I see it online?" "Not that one. The image isn't in the public web system. You can come in and request it." "What's the plat called?" She read from her screen. "Looks like Mercer Tract." That got my attention. "My mother was a Mercer." "Well then, you may know more about it than I do." "I don't think I do." She laughed lightly. "We open at 8:30 tomorrow." I thanked her and hung up. For the rest of the afternoon, I kept looking at that faded line. I still thought I was dealing with an ordinary boundary problem, maybe an old survey, maybe a fence that had been wrong for 50 years, maybe nothing at all. The next morning, I drove to the Cedar County Records Office expecting to find an old farm plat. What I found instead was a piece of paper recorded more than a century before Ashford Glen existed, and in one corner of it was a parcel nobody had shown me on a single modern map. The county records office was in an old brick building behind the courthouse. I got there a little after 9. The woman at the counter remembered my call from the day before. I gave her the book and page number again, and she disappeared into a back room. A few minutes later, she came back carrying a large archival sleeve. Inside was a sheet of paper bigger than I expected, yellowed around the edges, brown ink, survey bearings, distances, names of adjoining landowners, an old road that no longer existed under the same name, and in the upper right corner, inside a small rectangular tract, were 4 words that stopped me cold. Mercer Family Burial Ground. I stood there staring at them. The clerk looked across the counter. Family of yours? My mother was a Mercer. She nodded. That would explain the name. I kept reading. The plat had been recorded on April 17, 1912. It showed a much larger Mercer tract divided into several pieces. Most of them looked like ordinary farm parcels. The burial ground was different. It had its own dimensions, its own boundary, its own label. It had not simply been marked with an X and the word cemetery. It had been drawn as a separate piece of ground. That was when I noticed the narrow strip running toward it, 20 feet wide. It connected the burial tract to what the plat identified as an old farm road. Beside it was a faded notation, access reserved. I leaned closer. That was something I had not expected. The faded deed back at my house had told me something was being excluded. This plat showed me what? A burial ground, and a way to reach it. I asked for a certified copy. While the clerk processed it, I asked her one question. Does this tell me who owns that parcel today? She shook her head. No. You'd have to follow the later records for that. That was all I needed to hear. The plat was not a magic answer. It was a starting point. I left the courthouse with the certified copy rolled inside a cardboard tube. On the drive home, I kept thinking about Vanessa's site plan. Her drawing showed the western side of the pool complex as one continuous piece of HOA property. No separate cemetery tract, no 20-foot access strip, no odd notch in the boundary, nothing. When I got back to the farm, I opened a digital copy of the modern parcel map on my laptop and laid the 1912 plat beside it. I wasn't trying to survey anything myself. I knew better. I was just comparing features I could recognize. Road alignment, the shape of the adjoining farm, a bend in the larger property line, the approximate location of the old farm lane. The more I looked, the stranger it became. The burial tract appeared to fall somewhere near the western side of the new pool site. How near, I couldn't tell. The old plat used bearings tied to landmarks that had changed over more than a century. Roads had moved. A creek had been altered. Tree lines had disappeared. Ashford Glen had been graded and replatted. There was no honest way for me to put one map over the other and say exactly where that old rectangle sat on the ground, so I called Owen Price. Owen had surveyed a timber parcel for me years earlier. He was in his late 50s, quiet, methodical, and allergic to anyone treating a tax map like a boundary survey. When he answered, I told him I had found an old plat tied to the eastern side of the farm. How old? 1912. That's old. It shows a family burial ground. There was a pause. Where? Near Ashford Glen. Another pause. Near the new pool? That's what I'm worried about. Send me the reference. I gave him the plat book and page number first. Then I sent photographs of the certified copy. He called back later that afternoon. I need the later deeds. That's what the clerk said. Good. What can you tell from the plat? That there was a separately described tract at that time. And the access? It's shown. Still valid? I didn't say that. There was Owen. One question, one answer. No drama. What do you need next? Anything that carries this description forward. Deeds, subdivision plats, developer conveyances, older surveys. So the 1912 plat doesn't settle it. No. I looked through the kitchen window toward the trees. But it matters. Yes, that was enough. Later that afternoon, I walked out to the eastern pasture carrying a photocopy. The construction crews had already left. The pool site was quiet. Through the trees, I could see sections of black fence going up around the new deck. The concrete had been poured. The mechanical building was nearly finished. From where I stood, the whole project looked too complete to have a 100-year-old problem hiding under it. I looked down at the Plat again, then toward the rough strip of ground between my pasture and the pool. There were no neat rows of white headstones, no cemetery gate, no sign, just trees, brush, uneven ground, a few scattered stones, one old oak large enough that it had probably been standing there before anyone in Ashford Glen was born. I did not touch anything. I did not start clearing brush, and I definitely did not start looking for graves. All I knew was that the county record called that ground a burial tract. The next morning, I called Vanessa. She answered with the clipped tone she used whenever she already thought she knew what the call was about. "What is it, Graham? I found the Plat reference." "What Plat?" "The one connected to the old deed. And? It shows a separate Mercer family burial tract near the western side of the development." Silence. Then, "How old is this record?" 1912. I could hear her exhale. "Graham, I know. Do you know who owns that parcel today?" "No." "Do you have a current survey placing it inside HOA property?" "No." "Then what exactly are you asking me to do?" "Nothing yet." That seemed to surprise her. "Nothing?" "I'm telling you there's a recorded tract on the old land records that doesn't appear on the plan you showed me." "That does not mean it disappeared illegally?" "I didn't say it did. Land changes hands." "I know. Parcels get combined." "I know. Boundaries get updated." "I know." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "So what happens now?" "I'm having Owen Price review the records." "A surveyor?" "Yes." "And until then?" "Until then, I don't know who's right." That answer took some of the fight out of her, for the moment. Finally, Vanessa said, "The pool opens in less than 3 weeks." "I heard. This project has been through professional review." "I understand." "Then I would appreciate it if you did not start telling people the HOA built on a cemetery." "I haven't told anybody that." "Good. And I won't unless the records and survey actually put it there." Another pause. "That's all I'm asking." It was probably the most reasonable conversation Vanessa and I had during the entire dispute. At that point, she had not seen the Plat. She knew only what I had told her. There was a 1912 record showing a burial tract somewhere near the project area. And she was right about one thing. A century-old record did not tell me what had happened to the land afterward. That answer was sitting in the deeds. Owen came to the farm 2 days later. He started at my kitchen table instead of in the field. I had the certified Plat laid out beside my deed. Older family documents, tax maps, and a copy of the modern Ashford Glen site exhibit. He spent almost an hour reading. Every few minutes he wrote a book and page number on a legal pad. Finally, he placed the modern map beside the 1912 Plat. "Here's the part I don't like." He pointed to the old burial tract, then to the same general area on the modern drawing. On the HOA exhibit, there was nothing there. The amenity area flowed straight across it. No separate parcel, no access strip, no exception. I said, "That's what bothered me." Owen nodded. "But absence on the new drawing does not tell us why it's absent." "Meaning?" "Maybe it was conveyed." "Maybe." "Maybe a later instrument changed the configuration." "Okay." "Maybe somebody simplified the drawing and failed to carry something forward." I looked at him. "That last one sounds bad." "It sounds possible." He turned back to the Plat and put his finger on a deed reference near the edge. "This is what I want." I leaned closer. "What is it?" "A later conveyance." "Later by how much?" "Decades." He wrote down the deed book and page. "If the cemetery tract changed hands, there should be a record somewhere in the chain." "And if it didn't?" "Then that matters too." The following morning, Owen went back to the county records office. I was repairing a gate near the cattle barn when my phone rang. "You find the deed?" I asked. I found one. What does it say? There was a pause. Then Owen said, the burial tract is referenced again. I stopped what I was doing. How? I want you to read the language yourself. Does it convey it? No. The answer came quickly. I leaned against the gate. So it's still separate? I didn't say that. Of course he didn't. What are you saying? I'm saying the deed does not erase the 1912 tract. I looked toward Ashford Glen. Beyond the trees, the new pool fence was still going up. For the first time, the problem had moved beyond an antique map. The cemetery parcel had survived long enough to show up in a later deed, and that deed was about to tell us exactly what the Mercer family had and had not sold. Owen brought the certified deed to my place that afternoon. It was the document he had called me about from the county records office, the one that, in his words, did not erase the burial tract. We spread it across my kitchen table. The deed was dated 1967. By then, the original Mercer acreage had already been divided among descendants and sold in pieces. Roads had changed. Neighboring parcels had changed names. Some property descriptions had become longer and harder to follow, but the paragraph Owen wanted me to read was simple. He pointed to it. I leaned over the page. Less and accept the family burial tract shown in Plat Book 3, page 17. I read it again. Same plat, same burial ground. 55 years after the 1912 record, the Mercer family was still excluding that tract when it sold the surrounding acreage. I looked at Owen. So they didn't sell the cemetery with the rest. Not in this deed. He moved his finger lower. The same instrument also referred to the reserved access serving the burial tract. That made the old plat feel different. Until then, 1912 had been a historical starting point. Now we had a later conveyance carrying the exception forward. I looked through the kitchen window toward Ashford Glen. So where does that leave the HOA? With more records to check. I smiled. You really hate conclusions. I hate bad ones. He gathered the papers. At this point, we know the burial tract was excluded in 1967. We still need to see what happened between then and the developer acquisition. That was when Owen suggested bringing in Rachel Harlan. Rachel was a property attorney who also did title examination work. She was 46, precise, and had a habit of going completely silent whenever she was reading something important. Owen sent her the plat, the 1967 deed, my older family records, and the modern Ashford Glen exhibit. 2 days later, the three of us met in her office. Rachel had arranged the documents by date. She started with the 1912 plat. This shows the burial tract as a separate piece of ground. Then the 1967 deed. This expressly excludes it from the larger conveyance. She moved to several later deeds. The language changed over time. Some instruments no longer repeated the full cemetery description. Instead, they referred back to earlier deeds. Rachel circled one of those references. This is why you cannot just look at the newest document and assume every older exception vanished. I asked, so the burial tract kept following the chain? The references did. She turned another page. That does not automatically answer current ownership, but I have not found a deed that clearly brings this tract into the surrounding property. That was the cleanest explanation I had heard. No claim that the HOA had stolen anything. No claim that I owned the parcel. Just one missing step. If the developer had acquired the burial ground, somewhere there should have been a document doing that work. Rachel reached the development era conveyance. The developer had acquired multiple pieces of land and combined them into the larger project that became Ashford Glen. The description was long. Road calls, adjoining tracts, survey references, parcel identifiers. Rachel worked through it slowly. Then she placed Vanessa's modern HOA exhibit beside it. On the exhibit, the amenity area looked simple. One continuous block of common property. Pool, clubhouse, landscaping, no cemetery parcel, no separate access strip. Rachel tapped the modern drawing. This is where the pictures stop matching, I said. The HOA map treats the whole area like one parcel. Yes, and you still don't see where the burial tract entered the developer's title. Correct. Owen leaned over the table. So the next question is whether the modern boundary drawing can be retraced back to a recorded source. Rachel nodded. Exactly. That was the point where their roles separated cleanly. Rachel could tell us what the deed said. Owen had to tell us where those descriptions landed on the ground. Before we left, Rachel pulled out one more document. A 1994 deed. It did not redraw the entire burial tract. It did something narrower. It referenced the older reserved access. I looked at her. So, that survived too, at least as a recorded reference. Owen took the copy. 20 feet? That's what the earlier instrument says. He nodded once. I'll include it in the retracement. That mattered, because even if the pool itself turned out to be outside the old tract, a fence across reserved access could create a separate problem. But we were not there yet. We still did not know exactly where anything fell on the ground. Construction kept moving. The mechanical building was finished. The western fence line went up. Furniture started arriving. The grand opening was now less than 2 weeks away. Then Vanessa called me. I need an update. Her voice was controlled. What kind? On whatever you and your surveyor are doing. We found a later deed. Silence. And? It still excludes the burial tract. Vanessa did not answer immediately. Then, our council has reviewed our ownership documents. That's good. Our closing package shows the amenity area as HOA common property. Then there should be a recorded document explaining how the excluded tract became part of it. Her tone sharpened. You are assuming it never did. No, I'm asking where it did. That stopped her for a second. I continued. Rachel is following the title chain. Owen is retracing the boundary. Rachel, property attorney. You hired an attorney now? I hired someone who reads title records for a living. Vanessa exhaled. Graham, this project has a title policy, engineering approval, permits, and a professional survey. I understand. And you still think all of that is wrong. I think 2 sets of records are describing the same ground differently. That was harder for her to dismiss. She shifted tactics. Do you have a survey showing the pool crosses anything? Not yet. Then stop implying that it does. I haven't said it does. You keep bringing up a cemetery beside a pool opening in 2 weeks. Because that cemetery is missing from your map. And our documents may explain why. I hope they do. Vanessa went quiet again. Then she said, the opening is next Saturday. I know. We are not canceling a major community event because you found an old exception that hasn't been located on the ground. I didn't ask you to. Good. The call ended there. For once, neither of us had much more to say. The records had gone as far as records could go without measurements. Owen started the field work the following Monday. He spent the first morning establishing modern control points around my farm and the subdivision edge. Then he worked backward into the older descriptions. I followed him for part of the day until he finally turned around. You know you don't have to watch every shot. I know. You're watching every shot. I'm curious. You're making me self-conscious. I stepped back. Better? No. Some of the old reference points were gone. A tree named in one description had disappeared decades earlier. One fence corner no longer existed. A road had been widened enough to destroy another reference. Owen expected that. Boundary retracement was not treasure hunting. He was not looking for a perfect 1912 marker waiting in the weeds. He worked from surviving evidence and later survey ties. Late that afternoon, he found an old iron monument near the tree line. Nothing dramatic, no date, no label, just buried iron in a location consistent with one of the later surveys. He measured it, checked another point, then checked both again. What does that give you? I asked. One reliable point. Only one? One good point is more useful than 5 guesses. By Thursday, he had enough control to begin carrying the disputed boundary south toward the pool complex. The first section did something I did not expect. It placed part of the legal line east of the old livestock fence. Vanessa had been right about that. The fence had wandered. For a moment, I thought that might be the whole answer. Maybe the old cemetery tract was farther from the pool than I had feared. Maybe the new construction was clear. Then Owen kept moving south. The water was already in the pool by then. bright blue. The deck had been washed. Stacks of new chairs sat near the clubhouse. From a distance, the project looked finished. Owen took another reading, then another. He stopped talking. I had learned enough about him to know that meant something. What? He raised one hand. Give me a minute. He checked his notes, took another measurement, then walked toward the black aluminum fence. He looked down, then toward the concrete beyond it, then back at the instrument. Finally, he said, "Graham, come here." I walked over. He pointed toward the ground near the fence. "If the retracement continues the way it's running, the reserved boundary comes through this area." I looked past him at the pool deck. "How close?" "I'm not giving you final numbers until I close the work." "Owen." He looked toward the mechanical building, then back at me. "The basin may be clear." That should have made me feel better. It did not. "The deck?" He folded his field book. "That's what we check tomorrow." And for the first time, the dispute stopped living only inside county books and old deeds. The line we had been chasing had finally reached the brand new pool. Friday morning, Owen came back with Luis, his survey technician, and enough measurements to stop talking in generalities. Not a final stamped survey yet, but close enough that he gave me one warning before they started. "Everything we marked today is preliminary until I close the survey." I nodded. That was the last time I asked him to qualify it. The pool was scheduled to open the next morning. You could feel the deadline everywhere. Construction crews were no longer building the place. They were polishing it. One man pressure washed the concrete deck. Landscapers spread fresh mulch beneath new ornamental trees. Stacks of white lounge chairs had been opened and lined up beside the fence. At the clubhouse entrance, 2 workers were hanging a banner. "Grand opening, Saturday, 9 a.m. Owen barely looked at it. He set up his instrument near the northern control point. Luis walked ahead with the rod. They started where the retraced boundary was still safely outside the pool enclosure. "Left 6 inches, Owen called. Luis adjusted. "Back 2. Another reading. A small wooden stake went into the grass. Then another. At first there was nothing dramatic about it. The line passed through an open strip beside the landscaping. Then it reached the first row of shrubs. Luis marked another point. A few yards farther south, the line approached the new black aluminum fence. Owen took the shot, checked his field book, took it again. "Mark it." Luis drove the stake. The fence stood several feet east of the mark, on the wrong side. I walked over. "So that fence crossed it. If the completed work confirms today's measurements, yes." That was enough. Luis moved south again. A few minutes later, there was no dirt left to put a stake into, only concrete. Owen directed him to the outer edge of the deck. Luis sprayed a small orange mark. It looked almost ridiculous, a little streak of paint on thousands of dollars of new concrete. But now that I knew what it represented, I couldn't stop looking at it. Owen carried the line farther. The next mark landed deeper on the deck. Still well outside the pool basin. That mattered. Whatever else was wrong, the swimming pool itself did not appear to have been dug directly into the old reserve tract. I felt relieved for about 30 seconds. Then Owen looked toward the mechanical building. The small block structure sat near the western side of the pool area, freshly painted, with new pumps and filtration equipment inside. Luis walked toward one corner. Owen took the measurement. 2 feet east. Luis moved. Another 6 inches. Another reading. "Mark it." Luis tied flagging near the base of the wall. That was when a construction supervisor walked over. "What are you doing?" Owen handed him a business card. "Boundary retracement." The supervisor looked toward me. "This for Mr. Voss?" "Yes. We have final turnover today. You can't block the work area." "We won't." The man looked at the orange paint on the deck. "What boundary?" Owen pointed north. "The adjoining property boundary." The supervisor pulled out his phone. I knew who he was calling before he dialed. Vanessa's black SUV arrived less than 10 minutes later. She parked at an angle beside the clubhouse. That was how I knew she was angry. Vanessa got out wearing a bright red blazer, white blouse, black pants, and carrying her dark red HOA binder. She crossed the deck fast. "What is going on?" Owen turned toward her. "Morning?" She pointed at the orange paint. "What is that?" "The retraced boundary." Her eyes moved from the paint to the fence, then to the mechanical building. "That is not the HOA boundary." Owen stayed calm. It is where the record evidence is placing it. Vanessa looked at me. So this is what you've been doing. Finding the line. We already have a line. Then Owen should end up in the same place. That did not improve her mood. She opened her binder and pulled out the modern site exhibit I had seen before. This is the amenity parcel. Owen glanced at it. I know. This entire area was surveyed. I'd like to review the underlying boundary survey. You don't need to review it. Owen shrugged. Then I'll finish mine. Vanessa looked toward the pool. Workers were arranging chairs along the far side. A woman was setting up a registration table beneath a white tent. Tomorrow morning, homeowners were supposed to be standing exactly where we were. Vanessa lowered her voice. You realize what you're doing the day before opening? I'm taking measurements, Owen said. She turned to me. You're creating a problem based on a record from 1912 that you still haven't shown belongs on this site today. We found later deeds. I know what you claim you found. And Owen is finding the boundary. Her face tightened. You do not have a final survey. No. Then stop acting like this is settled. I'm not. That was the truth. I still didn't know how the whole thing would end. But orange paint was now crossing brand new concrete, and that was harder to ignore than a faded line in a deed book. Owen called Luis back. They continued south. The retraced boundary stayed west of the pool basin, but it crossed the outer deck. Then it ran close enough to the mechanical enclosure that the western corner appeared to sit inside the reserved tract. Owen marked the location in his field book. Vanessa watched every movement. Finally, she asked, How much of the deck? Several feet in this section. And the pool? The basin looks clear. She exhaled. I did too. Then Owen pointed toward the mechanical building. This corner is a separate issue. Vanessa looked at the flagging beside the wall. No. Nobody answered. That building is on HOA property. Owen said, That is what your project exhibit shows. And your survey says otherwise. My measurements say the older reserved boundary runs through this side. Vanessa pulled out her phone. I'm calling council. That makes sense, I said. She stared at me. You sound very pleased with yourself. I'd be more pleased if all of this ended up on your side. She didn't believe me, but I meant it. A bad survey was cheaper than cutting concrete. A mistaken suspicion was cheaper than a title dispute. I would have happily been wrong. Rachel arrived about 20 minutes later. She carried a black folder, not the full title file. She had come for one reason, the access corridor. Owen had already seen the 1994 reference in Part 3. Now he had enough control on the ground to start locating it. Rachel handed him one page. This is the later access reference. He nodded. I've got the earlier width. 20 feet. Vanessa looked between them. What access? Rachel kept the explanation short. The recorded access serving the burial tract. Vanessa frowned. I thought we were talking about a boundary. We are. Owen looked toward the fence. This is separate. He took another series of measurements. Luis walked the line, then stopped. The old access corridor ran toward the reserved tract from the direction of the former farm road. The new pool fence crossed it almost squarely. Owen pointed. If the access references hold with the title work, your fence blocks the corridor here. Vanessa stared at the fence. For the first time that morning, she didn't answer immediately. The deck was one problem. The mechanical building was another. Now the fence had created a third. She called the HOA attorney. While she was on the phone, Owen and Luis finished the section near the tree line. I followed them away from the deck. The ground there looked nothing like the polished pool complex. Uneven grass, brush, an old oak, several scattered stones partly sunk into the soil. One had a flat face. I pointed at it. Marker? Owen shook his head. Stone. You always this helpful? Yes. He looked across the ground. Don't touch anything. I wasn't going to. If this really is burial ground, identifying graves is somebody else's job. I looked back toward the pool. The contrast was strange. 20 yards away, workers were lining up chairs beneath umbrellas. Here, nobody even knew for certain what was below the grass. That was when the story changed for me. Up to that point, This had been about where somebody could legally pour concrete, where a fence belonged, whether a building crossed a boundary. Those were ordinary property problems. Expensive, maybe, but ordinary. A cemetery was different. The old record told us what the ground had been reserved for. It did not tell us whether burials were still there, and I did not want anyone guessing. Vanessa came over after finishing her call. Our attorney wants whatever survey documents you're prepared to release. Owen nodded. He'll get them when I close the work. And the title records? Rachel said. I'll send the relevant recorded instruments. Vanessa looked toward the orange marks. The opening is tomorrow. Nobody answered. She looked at me. 300 families have been waiting for this. I know. Staff is scheduled. Vendors are booked. The board has announced the opening twice. I know. And you expect us to stop because of a line that hasn't even been finalized. I expect the board to decide what risk it wants to take. Her face flushed. This project was surveyed, permitted, inspected, approved. We have engineers. We have counsel. We have title insurance. I looked at the orange mark nearest the deck. And now you have another survey. Vanessa followed my eyes. That was the first time all morning she had nothing to say. By late afternoon, Owen packed up. Before leaving, he gave me the short version. The basin is clear. The deck crosses. The mechanical building? Part of it appears to cross. The fence crosses the boundary, and the access route looks like another problem. I glanced toward the rough ground beneath the oak. What about what's buried there? That is not a surveying question. When do we know? When the right people look. That evening, Ashford Glen acted like nothing had changed. The pool lights came on. The water reflected blue against the clubhouse windows. Balloons appeared near the entrance. A red ribbon stretched across the gate. I stood on my side of the property and watched for a few minutes. Then Rachel called. She had found a specialist who could review the cemetery site without disturbing it. No digging, no assumptions. Just records, surface examination, and, if appropriate later, non-invasive scanning. When? I asked. Next week at the earliest. So, not before the opening? No. I looked toward the lights beyond the trees. Think they'll postpone? That depends on Vanessa, the board, and their attorney. At 8:17 that night, I got my answer. An email went out to every Ashford Glen homeowner. Rachel forwarded it to me. The subject line read, "Tomorrow's grand opening is on schedule." I read it once, then again. On my kitchen table sat the certified 1912 Plat Vanessa had still never seen. Less than 13 hours later, she would. The next morning, Vanessa finally saw the 1912 Plat for herself. That was the moment I told you about at the beginning. The bright red blazer, the finished pool behind her, the grand opening banner over the gate, and one yellowed county record spread across a registration table. But the argument on the deck lasted only a few minutes. What happened afterward decided whether anyone was getting into that pool. Rachel arrived just before 8:30. Owen came with the boundary sketch and the measurements he had checked again that morning. Vanessa had already called the HOA attorney, Mark Bellamy. By 8:34, all of us were inside the clubhouse conference room. Vanessa. 3 other board members, Rachel, Owen, me, Mark joined by speakerphone. Through the glass wall behind him, or behind the phone, I guess, we could see volunteers finishing the setup outside. Parents were already arriving. Children carried towels and goggles. The ribbon was still stretched across the entrance. Mark started with Owen. Your final survey is not recorded yet? No. But you completed the field checks this morning? Yes. And in your professional opinion, do HOA improvements cross the retraced boundary? Owen answered immediately. Yes. Vanessa leaned forward. How much? Mark interrupted. Let him finish. Owen slid the sketch across the table. The pool basin is outside the reserved tract. That was the first thing he said. And it mattered. Nobody had built the swimming basin directly over the cemetery parcel, but then he pointed to the western edge. The outer deck crosses the retraced boundary. So does a portion of the mechanical enclosure. The fence also crosses the line. He moved his finger slightly. And based on the recorded access references, the fence appears to block the 20-foot access corridor. The room went quiet. Vanessa looked at Mark's speakerphone. This is still his survey, not ours. Mark said, correct. Our surveyor approved the site. I know. We have title insurance. I know. We have permits. I know that too. Vanessa sat back. Then why are we talking about canceling an opening based on one competing survey? Rachel opened her folder. Because the survey is not the only issue. She placed 3 documents on the table. The 1912 Plat, the 1967 deed, the later access reference. She did not walk everyone through the entire title chain again. She only pointed to what mattered. The burial tract was expressly excluded from a later conveyance. I have not found a recorded instrument clearly bringing it into the developer's title. One board member, Thomas Reed, looked at her. So you're saying the HOA doesn't own it? No. Rachel's answer came quickly. I'm saying the HOA has a title question it cannot answer this morning. That was a better way to put it. Mark agreed. The board now has actual notice of a boundary and title dispute affecting permanent improvements. Vanessa looked toward the pool. Outside, someone was testing the microphone. A burst of feedback came through the patio speakers. She turned back. What happens if we open? Mark paused. If the HOA's documents are ultimately confirmed, then the delay may prove unnecessary. Vanessa nodded. Exactly. But if they are not, he continued, the board will have knowingly operated the facility after receiving notice that improvements may encroach on an excluded burial tract and interfere with recorded access. Nobody spoke. Mark added, my recommendation is postponement until the title and boundary issues are reviewed. Vanessa stood. No. Carol Jennings, another board member, looked up. Vanessa. No, we are 15 minutes from opening. She pointed through the glass. We have families outside, vendors, lifeguards, food, staff. The board sent an email last night saying the opening was proceeding. Thomas said, that was before Owen finished the checks. It is still not a final court determination. No one said it was. Vanessa turned toward me. This is exactly what you wanted. No. Her expression hardened. You bring an old cemetery record here on opening morning and now you expect me to believe you didn't want this stopped? I wanted the line checked. The line was checked. By Owen, too. She stared at me. I kept my voice down. If your title and survey are right, you lose a few days. And if yours are wrong, then I pay for being wrong. That answer stopped her. Because I had never asked Ashford Glen to give me the pool. I had never asked for the subdivision to be punished. I had asked them to stop long enough to figure out what was underneath their own paperwork. Carol looked at Mark. Can we reopen later if this turns out to be nothing? Yes. Thomas asked the next question. And if we open now and it turns out not to be nothing? Mark said. That is much harder to undo. The clock on the wall read 8:49. Vanessa looked around the table. The HOA had 5 board members. Denise Porter joined by phone from outside where she had been coordinating volunteers. Michael Tran sat near the end of the table, reading Owen's sketch. Vanessa made her case one last time. The project had taken more than a year. Professionals had reviewed it. The basin itself was clear. No grave had been confirmed. No court had ruled against the HOA. All of those things were true. Then Michael looked at the access reference. If this corridor is valid, our fence is sitting across it right now? Owen nodded. Yes. Michael looked toward the gate. That bothers me more than the deck. Vanessa said, we don't know that it's still enforceable. Rachel answered, which is why you resolve it before opening, not after. The vote happened at 8:53, 3-2. Postpone. Vanessa and Denise voted to proceed. Thomas, Carol, and Michael voted to stop. For several seconds, nobody moved. Outside, children were gathering near the ribbon. Someone had tied red and white balloons to the fence. A neighborhood photographer stood beside the podium. Vanessa closed her binder. I'll make the announcement. Carol started to stand. I can... No. Vanessa's voice had gone flat. I'll do it. At 8:56, she walked outside. I stayed in the conference room. This was not a moment I wanted to stand beside her for. She stepped to the microphone and told the crowd the opening was being postponed because of an unexpected property record issue requiring legal review. She did not mention me. She did not say cemetery. For about 5 minutes, that worked. Then someone posted a photograph of the Plat online. By 9:10, almost everyone outside knew what the issue was. Phones came out, parents started talking. A man walked to the western fence and stared at the orange survey marks on the concrete. Someone asked whether the HOA had built the pool on top of graves. Nobody could answer that. Not Vanessa, not me, not Rachel, not Owen. And that uncertainty did more to empty the crowd than any announcement could have. The vendors began packing. Parents gathered towels that had never been used. The lifeguards stood around waiting for instructions. At 9:40, the water was still perfectly blue. The chairs were still lined up. The ribbon was still tied across the entrance, and the gate was locked. For the first time since the project began, Ashford Glen stopped looking forward to the pool and started looking backward through its records. By noon, Mark had requested the complete title file. The management company started pulling development correspondence. The project engineer was asked for older survey materials. Owen began preparing the formal survey package. Rachel kept tracing the deeds. I went home. I expected to feel relieved. Instead, I felt tired. The closed gate did not prove I was right. It only bought everyone time to find out. That afternoon, Rachel called. The access issue is stronger than I thought. How? The later reference doesn't just mention the old road, it ties the reserved access back to the burial tract. So the fence is a separate problem. If the easement remains valid, yes. I looked through the window toward the subdivision. And the graves? I've contacted a cemetery site specialist. How soon? Next week. No digging? No. Good. The pool stayed closed Monday, then Tuesday. The HOA sent residents another notice saying the facility would remain unavailable pending property and historical site review. This time, the notice came from the full board. Vanessa's name was nowhere on it. Then late Tuesday afternoon, Rachel called again. Her voice sounded different. Focused. I found something in the project file. What? A due diligence checklist. I stood up. What does it say? There's an item concerning a prior cemetery exception. I didn't answer. Rachel continued. It says ownership and boundary were supposed to be verified before final site improvements. I looked toward the trees separating my farm from Ashford Glen. Before construction? Before final site work. Who saw it? I'm still tracing that. Did Vanessa? I don't know. That answer was important, because the document did not prove anyone knowingly built over graves. It did not prove anyone understood where the tract was. But it did prove something else. The cemetery exception had not been invisible. Somebody had seen it before the pool was finished. And somewhere between that warning and the concrete deck, the question had simply stopped being asked. Rachel emailed me the checklist 10 minutes after we hung up. At first glance, it looked almost boring. No red warning stamp. No handwritten note across the top. No dramatic legal language. Just a routine due diligence sheet from the pool project. Utilities, drainage, insurance, survey coordination, title exceptions. Rachel had highlighted one line. Prior cemetery exception. Ownership plot boundary to be verified before final site improvements. I read it twice. Then I called her. Who wrote this? A consultant reviewing the project file. When? Months before the deck was poured. Did Vanessa see it? I don't know. That answer mattered, because by then it would have been easy to tell the story the wrong way. Easy to say Vanessa knew there were graves beside the pool and ordered construction to continue anyway. The file did not prove that. It proved something narrower and more important. Someone involved in the project had found the cemetery exception before final site work, and they had marked it unresolved. Rachel had started rebuilding what happened next from the email trail. The consultant sent the checklist to the project team. An engineer forwarded the title item to management. Management asked whether the developer side title people had cleared it. Someone responded that revised site documents were coming. Then the conversation moved to other things. Drainage revisions, fence placement, mechanical equipment, budget, schedule. A newer site exhibit appeared. On that drawing, the burial tract was not separately shown. After that, the cemetery item stopped appearing in the active correspondence. Nobody wrote, resolved. Nobody attached a deed showing the tract had been acquired. The question simply fell out of the workflow. Rachel called it an open item that had never been formally closed. I called it the kind of mistake that becomes expensive only after concrete is involved. By Wednesday, the HOA board had the same file. That changed the argument. Vanessa had spent weeks saying the project had passed through too many professionals for a century-old cemetery record to have any real effect. Now the board knew at least one professional had noticed it. That did not mean Vanessa had caused the original mistake, but it did mean the project could no longer be defended by saying nobody had any reason to look deeper. Thomas Reed called me that afternoon. "I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "If the HOA fixes the encroachment, what do you want?" "The boundary corrected." "That's it? And the cemetery protected if the site assessment confirms we need to protect it. No personal payout?" "If there are actual damages, Rachel can deal with them." "I mean beyond that." I understood. He wanted to know whether I was trying to turn this into revenge. "No." Thomas was silent for a moment. Then he said, "That helps." "With what?" "The board." By then, Ashford Glen was splitting into camps. Some residents wanted the pool opened immediately. Others wanted the entire site shut down until every cemetery question was answered. Most just wanted to know how the HOA had reached grand opening morning with an unresolved title exception buried in its own files. Vanessa was losing the one thing she had controlled from the beginning: confidence. Owen finished his survey that week. The final measurements did not change the basic picture. The pool basin stayed clear. The outer deck crossed the reserved boundary. Part of the retaining structure crossed. A corner of the mechanical enclosure crossed. The fence crossed the boundary and blocked the recorded access corridor. Those were no longer orange marks and preliminary measurements. They were on a completed survey, stamped, dated, documented. Then Dr. Elaine Whitaker visited the cemetery tract. She specialized in archaeological and historic burial site assessment. Her first visit was almost deliberately uneventful. She photographed the ground, mapped the surface, reviewed the old plat, marked areas that had been graded, looked at the old stones beneath the trees. She did not dig. She did not move anything. A few days later, her team returned with ground-penetrating radar equipment. The machine moved slowly across the reserved tract in narrow passes. Back and forth, line after line. There was nothing dramatic about watching it. The results were different. Dr. Whitaker identified several subsurface anomalies consistent with possible grave shafts. She was careful with every word. Not confirmed human remains, not proof that every anomaly was a grave, but enough to say the ground should not be treated like ordinary landscaping. Two of the stronger anomalies were near the portion of the tract closest to the pool improvements. One was near the area that had been graded behind the deck. The basin remained outside that area. That never changed. But the question of whether the cemetery still existed on the ground was no longer something the HOA could laugh away. Rachel called after the report came in. "This will slow the project. It already feels stopped. This is different. What happens now? Protect the site, resolve the title, then deal with whatever construction has to move. Does anybody have to excavate? Not automatically. Good. I meant that. I did not want anybody digging for the sake of proving a point. If people were buried there, they had already been left alone for more than a century. The least we could do was stop treating the ground like a paperwork problem." The next HOA board meeting filled the clubhouse event room. I went this time. So did Rachel. Mark Bellamy attended in person. Owen brought the completed survey. Dr. Whitaker's report was included in the board packet. Vanessa sat at the front in a red blazer with her dark red binder closed beside her. She looked tired. Not defeated. Tired. Mark spent less than 10 minutes explaining the situation. The board had a recorded historical burial tract, a later deed excluding it from a larger conveyance, a completed survey showing HOA improvements crossing the retraced boundary, a recorded access issue, and a non-invasive site assessment identifying possible grave features. Then he added the piece that changed the room. The project file also contains a prior note directing that ownership and boundary of the cemetery exception be verified before final site improvements. A homeowner in the second row said, "So somebody knew?" Mark turned toward him. Somebody knew an unresolved title exception existed. That's not the same thing? No. The room stayed quiet. Mark continued. There is no evidence before me that the board knowingly authorized construction over identified graves. Vanessa looked up. That distinction mattered to her, and it was fair. Then Mark said, but there is evidence that a title issue was flagged and not formally resolved before construction continued. That distinction mattered to everyone else. The board's options were becoming narrower. Vanessa argued for one more title review before committing to demolition. That was reasonable. The board allowed it. The title insurer became involved. So did the developers' council. They reviewed the recorded instruments again and asked one simple question. Where was the deed that brought the excluded burial tract into the developer's title? Nobody produced one. That did not automatically make me sole owner. The history was too old and too fragmented for that kind of clean ending. But the HOA had a more immediate problem. It could not show a clear right to keep permanent improvements across the reserved tract while blocking access to it. The conversation shifted from, is there really a problem, to what has to move? The first remediation proposal called for cutting back the western deck, rebuilding part of the retaining feature, shifting the affected portion of the mechanical enclosure, relocating the fence, and reopening the access corridor. It also created a protected buffer around the area Dr. Whitaker had identified for further cemetery review. Vanessa opposed it. This is excessive. Thomas looked at her. What's the alternative? We continue the title process. We have. We litigate if necessary. Mark answered before Thomas could. That is an option. Vanessa looked at him. And? It is the most expensive option with the least predictable timeline. That was the moment the room moved away from her. Not dramatically. Nobody shouted. Nobody applauded. The board simply stopped following. The final remediation agreement kept the pool basin where it was. Most of the deck remained. The HOA did not have to destroy the entire aquatic center, but the improvements inside the disputed tract had to come out. The access corridor had to be restored, and the cemetery area could not be disturbed unless a lawful process later required it. The board approved the agreement 4-1. Vanessa was the only no vote. 8 days later, she resigned as HOA president. There was no confrontation between us. No apology, no scene where she admitted I had been right all along. Her resignation email said she believed the project had been handled in good faith and that continued focus on her role had become a distraction for the community. That was the end of her presidency. I saw her once after that. I was meeting Owen near the survey line when Vanessa came out of the clubhouse. She wore a red coat. For a second she looked in our direction. Then she got into her SUV and drove away. Owen watched her leave. No final argument? I think we used them all. He looked toward the pool. The water was still blue. The gate was still locked, and across the western edge of the deck were the marks showing exactly what had to be removed. A few weeks earlier, this had started with one old fence, one faded deed reference, and a question about where a line belonged. Now the argument was over. The only thing left was the concrete. The demolition crew arrived on a Monday morning. Same contractor, same pool, different job. 3 months earlier, I had watched machines push dirt toward the old boundary. Now I watched a concrete saw cut a clean line through the brand new deck. The crew started with the western edge. Owen's final survey had already marked exactly what had to come out. The saw moved through the concrete. Sections were cut free, lifted, loaded onto a trailer. The pool basin stayed where it was. So did most of the deck. But the part crossing the reserved tract disappeared piece by piece. The retaining structure was rebuilt inside the confirmed HOA boundary. Then came the mechanical enclosure. A portion of it had to be dismantled and shifted east far enough to clear the line. New utility runs followed. The black aluminum fence came down next. For months, that fence had crossed the old access corridor as if the route had never existed. The replacement fence bent around the protected ground instead. A 20-foot access route remained open. No pool furniture, no landscaping beds, no mechanical equipment, just access. Owen returned after the work was finished. He checked the corrected corners and set permanent survey monuments. One of them stood only a short distance from where Luis had sprayed that first orange mark across the deck. The orange paint had been temporary. This wasn't. The cemetery tract itself stayed quiet. Dr. Whitaker's recommendation was simple. Protect the ground and do not disturb the areas showing possible burial features unless a lawful process later required it. So that was what happened. No digging, no spectacle, no attempt to turn the place into some neighborhood attraction. The brush was managed carefully. A small historic marker was placed near the access route. Nothing more. Ashford Glen finally opened the pool later that summer. There was no second grand ceremony, no ribbon, no speeches. Families simply started using it. From my pasture, the place looked almost the same. Blue water, white chairs, kids shouting from the shallow end. You had to know where to look to notice that one edge of the deck was narrower than originally planned, or that the fence changed direction near the old trees, or that a strip of ground between my farm and the pool was no longer treated like part of the amenity complex. One afternoon, I walked past the new survey monument on my way to check the west pasture. Behind me, I could hear children at the pool. Ahead of me, the fence ran exactly where it was supposed to. That was enough. A few weeks after the pool finally opened, one of the Ashford Glen homeowners stopped me near the fence. He nodded toward the water. "You happy you beat them?" I looked past him at the pool. Kids were splashing in the shallow end. Parents were sitting under the umbrellas. From that distance, you would never know part of the deck had been cut out and rebuilt. "No," I said. He looked surprised. "I'm happy they fixed it." That was the difference. The pool was new. The concrete was new. Even the neighborhood was new. But ownership didn't begin when somebody poured concrete. That little piece of ground had been sitting in the county record since 1912. The problem wasn't that the record was old. The problem was that everybody building around it had started acting like it was gone. A week later, I was back repairing fence on the west pasture. Beyond the trees, I could still hear kids at the pool. Between us stood the new survey monument. Same ground, same line. Only now, everyone knew where it was. If you enjoy stories where old property records collide with modern HOA power, subscribe. There are plenty more lines people think disappeared.